So you all know that we do COFES. Cyon Research puts on COFES. But believe it or not, we actually have other business, and we do research, and we do think a lot about what happens in the industry. A few years ago, I gave a presentation Saturday night where we had something that's called the bubble diagram. And we're going to get to the end of that and take an update on what that bubble diagram looks like. But first, what we want to do is to take a look back and to look at a wide variety of perspectives of not only of the industry, but of things in general, to help shape our understanding of the environment that we're in and of this industry. Now, I wrote this slide before we actually listened to Bruce's keynote, but Bruce has said that what we name affects what we do. This is kind of like the observation effect, only a little bit opposite. What we predict also affects what we invent. And I want to take a look at two very specific things that we looked at. One is drafting Dan. It says 50 years ago, Robert Heinlein, in a book, The Door into the Summer, wrote the first instance of what could be considered a CAD system. And this is before the work by Sutherland. And I have somebody was kind enough to read this.
A drafting machine to be operated like an electric typewriter. I guess that there must be easily 50,000 engineers in the U.S. alone bending over drafting boards every day and hating it because it gets you in your kidneys and ruins your eyes. Not that they didn't want to design, they did want to, but physically it was much too hard work. This gizmo would let them sit down in a big easy chair and tap keys and have the picture unfold on an easel above the keyboard. Depress 3 keys simultaneously and have a horizontal line appear just where you want it. Depress another key and you fill it in with a vertical line. Depress 2 keys and then 2 more in succession and draw a line at an exact slant. Gripes, for a small additional cost as an accessory, I could add a second easel, let an architect design an isometric, the only easy way to design, and have the second picture come out in perfect perspective rendering without his even looking at it. Why, I could even set the thing to pull floor plans and elevations right out of the isometric.
So, we've done this. We've actually done this. It's taken us about 40 or 50 years, but we've gotten there. And just for the record, in The Door into Summer, he was predicting this for 1970, and 1970 was a little bit premature. For the full flavor of this, but not only did he predict it, he also predicted the impact of it. And this next quote, I think, is equally interesting.
But John could see the importance of drafting Dan. When I showed him how I could write my signature, recognizably my own, just by punching keys, I admit I had practiced, his eyebrows stayed up. Chum, you're going to throw draftsmen out of work by the thousand. No, I won't. The shortage of engineering talent in this country gets worse every year. This gadget will just help to fill the gap. In a generation, you're going to see this tool in every engineering and architectural office in the nation. They'll be as lost without it as a modern mechanic would be without power tools.
30 years later, Apple came out with a very prescient video. Many of you know it, but many of you have never seen it or heard it. I have it's called the Knowledge Navigator, and I have a couple of clips from it to give you an idea of its impact.
You have a lecture at 4:15 on deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Right. Let me see the lecture notes from last semester. No, that's not enough. I need to review more recent literature. Pull up all the new articles I haven't read yet.
Journal articles only?
Fine.
Your friend Jill Gilbert has published an article about deforestation in the Amazon and its effects on rainfall in the sub-Sahara. It also covers drought's effect on food production in Africa and increasing imports of food.
Great if you were available to make a few comments. Nothing formal. After my talk, you would come up on the big screen, discuss your article, and then answer some questions from the class.
And bail you out again? Well, I think I could squeeze that in. You know, I have a simulation that shows the spread of the Sahara over the last 20 years. Here, let me show you.
Nice. Very nice. I've got some maps of the Amazon area during the same time. Let's put these together.
Great. I'd like to have a copy of that for myself.
What happens if we bring down the logging rate to 100,000 acres per year? Interesting. I can definitely use this. Thanks for your time, Jill. I really appreciate it.
No problem. But next time I'm in Berkeley, you're buying the dinner.
Dinner, right.
So, now, for Cyon research, we've been focusing a significant amount of our efforts on the 3D market map. That's a map of the market of the 3D industry. And we focus on market dynamics, and we've been paying attention more recently to globalization. And I have a 3-hour presentation for you this morning that I'm going to try and squeeze in 40 minutes. But it starts off with some unusual ideas and some very, very straightforward, easy thoughts. But it takes us down a road or a path that I didn't expect it to go. So, as a species, we crave stability and predictability, but the Earth itself is not a steady-state system. And change not only does change happen, but it's necessary for us to live and breathe. I mean, if we had a static environment, we wouldn't be here. And we've always lived with change, but what's changing is how fast change is happening. And for those of you who do differentials, this is called jerk, and jerk is uncomfortable. And what's different today is that the rate of change, significant change, instead of happening relatively slowly, we're getting major changes that are happening within our own lifetimes. Another issue is that when we're dealing in a very big environment and we make an impact, that impact is generally absorbable by the system. If you take you're in the Amazon and you burn a field down to farm, if you're just one farmer, it's not a big deal. But if you're several million farmers or tens of million farmers, you've deforested the landscape, and those changes are noticeable in the environment overall. And we have a tendency as a species to take something and then just scale it up beyond the ability of our systems to absorb it. And you can I'm talking pretty much dimensionless here, but you can look at almost anything that we do. Oil consumption is one issue. How we grow and do mass feeding of the earth, growing rice and wheat in massive areas, it changes the environment. Having a garden here in Phoenix is wonderful, but if you get hundreds of people or millions of people or in the same area, you no longer have this asthma-free environment. You have an environment just like everyone else. So we have, if we look at the global community, proximity and dilution make a difference. And it also makes a difference when we're talking about information, and there's a flow of information. And the closer things are, the easier it is to move things back and forth. But there are other issues that deal with or impact the gradient of information. And those other things lead to something that I refer to as a viscosity of transaction. That is, some things happen very, very easily and fluidly, and other things are like molasses, very, very slow and difficult. Pat Sewerman from the University of Florida, PhD student, spent a significant amount of time developing this very simple diagram that says that if we looked at a particular individual of a specific type, and I'm not going to go into the details behind it, but the numbers are accurate, it was incredibly difficult to find this information. But this is the cost of the salary of a person in 1994 in China, India, and the U.S. doing the same job. And again in 2000, and again in 2007. And you can see that, you know, the cost of the people over those time periods has gone up. But what's really interesting is the differential between doing business in the United States and doing business in India and China is decreasing over time. In 1994, there was an incredible pressure to get stuff to China because it was so cheap. But as you can see, the factor, you can get 6.9 times as many people for the price of one in China, whereas it was 35 in 1994. Now, this is for one particular metric. This is not intended to go for everything that you do, and it doesn't include any of the other overhead costs, such as distance, language, culture, time zones, etc. But if you think about this particular aspect of it, you can see that as prices rise in different areas, and as the landscape changes, you actually get a dynamic system that if you wanted to, you could actually map out as changing weather patterns. And there's actually something that you can refer to as weather patterns of economic location. Now, I have a theory here that I'd like to present. Scale matters, and if you think about scale in a dimensionless matter, if you can assume that variations of a characteristic, and it doesn't matter what that characteristic is, if you assume that that characteristic is distributed on a normal curve, then the larger the population, the greater the number of individuals with a given level of deviation from that norm. So I will, if you look here, you can see that at this level of deviation, it's proportional, but the absolute number is increasing. Also, the larger the population, the greater the likelihood of a non-zero person happening out here at the extremes. And you can either think of this as over time, where once every 400 years we get a Newton or an Einstein, or you can think over in a static period, the larger the population in a given time period, the more likely it is that you're going to have somebody who is at the extremes. In many areas, there are characteristics that are desirable and undesirable. And if you look at this, again, this is a valueless curve. If we look at what happens at the ends, as we get further, we have, because people are a stepwise function, you know, it's hard to have a fraction of a person. It's likely that as the population increases, that you're going to have somebody out here at a very high level of deviation from the norm, or a high sigma, if you will. And what's interesting is that if you have a given bandwidth for something, that if you're only paying attention to a given bandwidth for something, the larger the population, the more extreme that bandwidth that you're paying attention to is allowed. I'll just read this. News reports on what's expected to capture our attention. I think that you'll agree that we don't generally pay attention to events that don't really deviate from the norm. They're normal. We don't really pay attention to them. I mean, you know, the sun rose today. How many of you noticed? Okay, we're engineers here. But I think that it would have been much more noticeable had the sun not risen, don't you think? But basically, low sigma events, events that happen that are close to the norm, really don't gather our attention. Another fact is that fear captures our attention more than joy. It's not that it's better than it, it's just, we're more aware of what is potentially going to have a negative impact on us. And as a result of that, the threshold that it takes for good news is higher than the threshold for bad news. If we have a given amount of bandwidth for news, and we have a half-hour news show, for instance, something's got to be really special because the news is driven by capturing our attention, because capturing our attention is what drives advertising. So, here's another way of looking at it. For equivalent news, if for equivalent news, the delta there, or the level of deviation of bad news, if we consider bad on the left, or undesirable on the left and desirable on the right, it's got to be stronger. And if it's stronger, that means it's going to occur less often. So the time allotted for news is static. And as the population increases, the net result is that the reporting of good news gets squeezed out by bad. What gets reported shifts to events with a higher severity or a higher sigma. And events in a given time period with a larger population are likely to have more severe events than going beyond previous extremes. And also, another way of looking at this is extreme events happen more often. And again, this is not a value judgment here on when I'm talking about extreme events. We can talk, for instance, on relative balance between Kennedy assassination and the moon landing. I mean, we have extreme events, what I would refer to as a very high sigma events, both captured world attention, both very different. So, if we look at another aspect of news, before the printing press, we were very much in a local environment. Communication was slow. It wasn't particularly reliable. But more importantly, things that happened in the outside world that affected us generally seemed arbitrary to us. We had no understanding or comprehension of what or why, and they would often appear without notice. Moving forward a few weeks, when we get to the radio age, we have lots of radio stations. And I'm talking about the golden era of the radio age, when people would gather around the radio to listen to programs. There's a shared experience for those programs, and the actions of the outside world have become more comprehensible, and the outside world has basically no longer appears without notice, except for things like weather, where a hurricane or a tornado would come without warning. We get to the golden era of TV, basically from the year I was born to the late 70s, to the year I graduated from college. We have few channels. Here in the U.S., we've got ABC, NBC, and CBS. For high sigma events, for highly unusual events, all of the networks broadcast the same message, and not only that, there wasn't any alternative to not listening to it. We had a shared experience, and that shared experience kind of drew us more to the center as a unifying cultural force. If we move forward to look at cable, cable is kind of the end of unity. At the same time that cable's coming on, we're getting lots of other television stations as well. We have lots of choices, and when this big message or this big event comes on, we can turn on the cartoon channel, or we can turn on something else, the sports channel. Not every station is covering everything all the time. We also have the rise of special interest content. And we are still in a broadcast media. That's a one-to-many area, but we're getting interest groups getting their attention focused on. When we come to the web is the, it's the great connector, and we're getting broadcast many-to-many. And what's happened is we have a self-sorting mechanism where like-minded individuals can get together and they kind of self-assemble. But what we've lost is there's no shared experience, no cultural force drawing us back to the mean. And we've also lost, that great cultural unifying force of television in the golden era also solidified the melting pot aspects of the United States in particular. But today we don't have that central force, so the melting pot seems to be no longer melting, and we have lots of little nuggets going on. At the same time, we have lots of positive effects, including the rise of cross-fertilization and something that I refer to as serendipity by Google. So in the golden age of TV, news was designed to attract customers to drive advertising revenue to other shows for customer loyalty. When I was growing up, I was an NBC viewer as opposed to a CBS, and nobody ever watched ABC. Others felt differently, other households. And we had the news broadcasters who were family figures. They were the grandfather figures, Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, etc. But what ran on those news programs was based on the value of it rather than on the attractiveness on it. But by the time we've gotten to the cable age, news has become a platform by and of itself for selling advertising. And as a result, they run what grabs our attention, and what grabs our attention is generally driven by things that are negative, and therefore you get the if it leads syndrome. At a low population, the number of individuals inclined to disruptive thoughts or behaviors may be small. If you look here at point A. But you can see that as the population increases, that number increases proportionally. That's to be expected. But what's interesting is, as the population grows, at some point in time, you get the appearance of individuals with the capacity to incite others to action. I used Bin Laden here, Mother Teresa, for those sci-fi fans. I'm blanking on the name of the trilogy. Foundation trilogy, thank you. There are a couple of characters in there who are at both extremes of this. But what happens is, and this is representative, but basically there's a dip here below A, and it drives these people from point A to point B, and it drives people to action. Now, the people who are here at point B, I call those people attractors. And attractors distort the bell curve. They're enabled by the web. They reinforce people to highly deviant activity, and I'm using the term deviant not in a negative sense, but deviating from the mean. And it also results in more extreme news. So that's my theory of news. So what? Well, it does explain a few things. If you talk to our colleagues here from the UK, often they will say that news from the US always seems worse than the news from the EU. Why is that? Well, EU has 400 million people. The US has 300 million people. You would think it would be the other way around. But in reality, EU is not a 400 million person market. It's a series of 10 to 40 million person markets that have a link in for major events to a 400 million person market, but mostly they're much smaller markets, and the only things that they hear from the US in a much further sense are things that are even more extreme. If you look at China, China's got a lot more people than we do. Why isn't the news there worse? Well, for one reason, they have a controlled media, and they have a somewhat controlled web, so the ability for people to meet with one another has a higher level of viscosity. And also they have a cultural and governmental very severe response to very high sigma activity. So the theory of news, we know the web has changed everything, but we have unintended consequences, and one of the unintended consequences is the web as an enabler for attractors, which changes the name of the game. So my question is, how do we apply this to our industry? How do we apply this knowledge to something that is more relevant to us on a business standpoint? So the question becomes, where are the attractors in our marketplace? What's happening here? I don't have an answer to this. I'm hoping somebody here will take this home and think about it and have Brian's waving his hand in the back. I'm hoping that this will be a point of discussion over the next few days and months. But I wanted to give you a picture of our industry to give you an idea of the landscape. And when we say we're dealing with 3D marketplaces, or the 3D market map, what we're trying to do is to make sense that our industry is not just PTC, UGS, and Dassault, or SolidWorks Inventor, Solid Edge, but it also has, there's an AEC side, and there's hardware, and there's chips, and it just keeps on going on till we get to Google and some other things up there. This is just notes that I jotted down while I was riding on a plane, and this isn't everybody even in this room. The intention of this slide is to give you an idea of the landscape that we're dealing with. And in order to get a handle on this, we look at vectors, or I look at vectors. And I look at them so that I can try and highlight opportunities and to identify principles and to learn across marketplaces and to see what we can gather. And it also is interesting to look at how we've used tools over the past. And we've had a flip-flop over a 20-year period between the scarcity of people and the scarcity of resources. What's interesting is that globalization and offshoring and better tools have changed the curve of this map. When I presented this last, we saw this map, and it's been fairly significant that we now have 3D CAD that you can get for free. But if you look at this and you update it, what's happened is that we're now changing the name of the game. We're getting better stuff at no cost, and we're putting extremely high-cost things at the same time in the hands of people of lower salary. And I'm sure there are implications here. I haven't figured it out yet. PLM. There are lots of different ways to describe PLM, and using different vectors to describe PLM is just one way of getting a handle on it. There are lots of other vectors that are parts of PLM. And we have lots of different, here's two vectors. We have going from creating to consuming, and we can have, that's the Y, and the what would be formats, toolkits, applications, and services, but we can put lots of different tasks or tools in there. But the bottom line is that these things aren't really a vector. Formats are kind of a little bit different, so we can fold that up and give that a third dimension. Another way of looking at it, this is a single vector, is to look at the different markets. We have GIS here, civil, plant, AEC, mechanical, mechatronics, EDA. They're all used to see, to use, to comment on, to interact with. GIS isn't really used to build on or to manufacture with. So that's what that says. You've all heard the joke, what's the difference between mechanical engineers and civil engineers? Mechanical engineers build bombs, and civil engineers build targets. This is another way of representing that joke. You can use size as a vector. EDA is the domain of the nano and micro, and GIS is in the domain of the kilometer, and other stuff happens in between. We can also use the number of elements that are dealt with. And by the way, these are cartoons. I'm sure that we can argue that plant needs to be more this way or more that way. I don't really care. It's the overall relationships that I'm interested in. Geometric complexity is another issue. Process complexity is another issue. Number of stakeholders is a vector that we can deal with. One of the interesting things about the number of stakeholders, if you look at it, it's very clear that there's a discontinuity in the AEC marketplace between investors and beneficiaries. UGS, when it was EDS at the time, created this little slide about looking at the complexity of the solution versus the number of users who have to deal with the information. Another vector is what you do in terms of process. And here, this is a slide from the 1970s, by the way, and they're talking about going from a 10% return to a 300% return to a 1,000% return, and we overlaid these boxes over it for a different way of thinking about automation, product data management, enterprise PDM, and if you think about the whole picture, maybe that's what PLM is. This is a slide from Jim Porter at DuPont, overlaid with a standard curve that basically says that if you don't change something early in the design cycle, you don't really have the opportunity to change it. And the more you move it to the left, the more likely you are to have something that works better and is more saleable and more profitable. So last year, I showed you this slide, which was a vector of process complexity mapped against product complexity. This is an old computer vision slide, and essentially says that when you're designing a hand tool or a toaster or a house, you're more concerned with the geometry than you are the process. And if you're designing an aircraft or a jet engine or a university, while the geometry may be more complex, you're more concerned with the process of it than you are with the actual geometry. Dassault has used the term personal product-centric design and process-centric design. If we look at product complexity, the domain of product complexity is personal productivity on the left and enterprise productivity on the right. And if we overlay that with geometric difficulty, we can see some different domains. GIS isn't particularly geometrically complex, but it does have incredible number of objects and complexity to it. Industrial design is just the opposite. And if you're dealing with drafting, you're not dealing with design, if you're dealing with drawings and not models, you're dealing with the lower left-hand corner. If you look at architecture, engineering, and construction, this is where I've placed the bubble. Process and plant kind of fits over here, and shipbuilding, and process-centric mechanical design, and offshore is thrown up there. And this big orange mass in the middle is what was referred to by Dassault as product-centric design, and it's also referred to as the mid-market or mid-range CAD, if we're talking about CAD. And that's really where we left it 3 years ago. And we can overlay products on here, and this was my overlay of the products at that particular point in time in the different industries. This was before Revit had grown up. And there you go, and we had this kind of funny thing, which was Pro-E was kind of had its feet in both the mid-range and the high end of the time, and we're not really sure where to put it. You can go a step beyond this and abstract that and throw some prices up there. And you go anywhere and you can pretty much find yourself on the map for those prices. So this is where we were. What's happened since then? Well, today I challenge you to find a geometry that isn't handled by a moderately cost product. If Inventor and SolidWorks and Solid Edge can't do it, Rhino can, or FormZ can, or Ashlar's products can. So what's happened is the complexity of the capacity of those products has also increased. And that mid-market or middle-class product has basically gone and done this if we're looking at these two vectors. At the same time, the high end, UGS, PTC, and Dassault, the CATIA, have repackaged their software. They've reconsidered the prices. They have basically made it possible to reach a smaller pocketbook and to make the tools more consumable. So they have increased the overlap to the point where that if you look at where we were and where we are today, there's no longer a differentiation by geometric difficulty and project complexity. That level of looking at the market no longer tells us what we need to know. And in reality, we have to consider another vector perpendicular to this to tell us whether we're dealing with a product that's 6,000, 10,000, or 20,000. What we're doing right now is trying to better understand that marketplace and to better define what those differentiations are so that we can come forward and let you understand the framework that you're working in. And hopefully sometime this summer we will have a better view for what, or an answer for really what is happening out in that direction. And with that, I thank you. I will, again, make sure that you have this, and I'd like to bring Joel back up to introduce Jesse.